Hi, I'm Siofra Bradigan, and this is Siofra's Magic Alcove. So while we were up there at the cabin, I had a lot of time to think and meditate, which is why I wanted to be there. It was awesome. I mean, it really was. It was truly wonderful to be able to sit in a place without any distractions. Every so often, there was the horses from the other part of the camp that would be going by, but it wasn't all the time. So, it really reminded me of being up north in my house by the river up in the Kispiox Valley, and made me think a lot about my beginnings and how I got to where I am. And one day I was sitting there, I was thinking about all that, and I was just thinking about influences and how what you're drawn to can really shape your path. I remember being a witch in another life. I remembered being burned at the stake when I was little. So that was kind of an influence right off the bat. I believed in witches. I knew I was a witch. And I also knew that sometimes it didn't end well. Although at that age I didn't understand exactly what that meant. It was definitely something that was in there. And I was afraid of fire. Big surprise, right? Why would I be afraid of fire if I was burned alive? I don't know. There'd be a reason. So I was trying to think back to my path and how I ended up here. And I remember one of the first things was learning about the Salem witch trials, which I was quite fascinated with because I knew I was a witch. And then I started trying to read books about it, and the only books I could find at the time were books that were written by Christians, like the Maleficarum, and some fiction books that someone wrote. There was some book I got in my book club or something like that, like my mother, like a book a month kind of club, and you could pick whatever title you wanted. There was one book that I wanted to read, which was supposed to be about witches and this young girl discovering, she wanted to be a witch, and she was doing all these spells and everything. And I was like, oh wow, this is really cool. And then at the end, none of her spells worked. It's like, oh, that's so sad. And then at the end, she accepted Satan and embraced hate. And then all of her spells worked because that's how magic works. It's all based on Satan and hate. And then I was very disappointed. I recall. I'm like, what? No, that's not how it goes. And that was my experience with most of the books I could come across. I would read and they would say what witches did, and I would go like, no, that's not what happened. So amazingly enough, I didn't swallow any of that stuff because in my head, I already had a narrative that what it meant. If someone doesn't have that narrative like I did, I could really sway them against witches reading that kind of stuff, which of course is one of the things that religious groups are trying to do. They don't want you to get into witchcraft because they think it's, accepting Satan as your personal whoever. Excuse me. So, I did bring my water, didn't I? Apparently I left it out. Nope, there it is. Okay, water. Need some water. So that was my first set of influences, and then Greek mythology. Greek mythology was mind-blowing because it told me that people had different beliefs at different times in different cultures. Different than what I believed at the time. Different than what my church that I was going to was teaching me. And so that was kind of like a... And then at some point, I think in adolescence, Sybil Leek came forward as a witch, a real witch, and started doing talk shows. I managed to see her on a talk show, which was way cool. It's like, oh, there still are witches, so isn't that awesome? And I listened to everything she said that I could find, and I bought her book, Diary of a Witch, and read that. So that was one of my early books, I guess, was Sybil Leek. And then in my late teens, early 20s, I found Bonewits' book, Real Magic. And that was another mind-blowing experience to read his stuff. because he was doing current research and so forth. He started the Druid movement in the United States. I don't think he was necessarily doing that at the time he wrote that book, but still, there was a lot of historical information about witches, what happened during World War II, etc. The price that a person can pay for magic, being that if you do magic to thwart someone's will, then you can pay the ultimate price, which is what happened to a group of witches in England who raised a huge cone of power to protect the country from Hitler and keeping him from ever setting foot on British soil. And several of the people who participated in that ritual died. So that was an interesting piece of information. And, it's like my first real spell, I guess, came from Bonewitz's book. That's when I really discovered that I could make stuff happen for real. We had a weird person staying in our house. He wasn't staying in our house. He was visiting. There was something about him that was off. I don't know what he was on, but he had some very strange vibes that day. And I had been reading Bonewitz's book, and one of the old spells they talked about in there was the broom spell for getting rid of an unwanted visitor. And so, barely with thinking about it at all, I walked into my kitchen and I picked up a broom and I brought it into the living room and stuck it in the corner. And I tell you, it was less than 5 minutes and that guy was out of our house. He became paranoid. He was sure we were narcs. The house was surrounded by cops and he had to get the hell out of there before they came in. So I was like, wow, now that worked. That's impressive. That gave me my first real visceral experience of how magic can actually be utilized to change circumstances. And so that was interesting. So he was definitely a big influence. Reading that book was an influence. And I don't know that I found much else to read for several years. I was too busy having children, being in bad relationships, going through trauma and so forth, to really have much time to delve into it. But backtracking, I started learning Tarot, the Rider-Waite deck, when I was in high school. So that was a foundation of symbolism and influences and, planets and astrology and all this other stuff that I absorbed by learning how to read the Tarot at that age. So that was definitely foundational too. So when I ended up leaving my second husband and going into the woods, into the bush with David, my partner at the time, that's when I found Starhawk's book. And that kind of propelled me to where I am now. That book was hugely influential. And it gave me an opening to my own subconscious and allowed me to start seriously the process of examining and rearranging my own brain, which is still something they don't think is possible, most psychologists, that whatever it is that you've been imprinted with up until a certain age, that's what you're going to carry for the rest of your life. And I wholeheartedly disagree, because I think you can rewire your own brain and you can get into your subconscious and you can change things if you know what they are, and that magic is the way to do that. So she was definitely highly influential. And I went to her workshop when I lived in Santa Cruz, which was after I moved from the Kispiox Valley, which was kind of cool that, she was from San Francisco and she did this weekend workshop. It was incredibly powerful and amazing and wonderful and terrific. And of course, I'd been practicing religiously since I started using her book and, getting acquainted more with the tides and the sabbats and the esbats and the symbolism and so forth, and reading this and that. I definitely had some early influences that made it not have been completely accurate, like Barbara Walker's Encyclopedia of Women's Myths and Secrets, which was fun. I loved it. But now some of her conclusions are debated. So who knows? But it certainly gave me a different form, a different model to sort of go after. Because as a woman, being born as a girl into the Methodist Church, I absorbed this idea that because I was female, there was something intrinsically wrong with me because it was my kind that caused all the problems in the world, Eve, etc. And that's where I sort of absorbed the idea that I was evil, there was something wrong with me, and there wasn't anything I could do about it, which thankfully therapy helped a lot with. Um, so in Santa Cruz, I started to evolve more into myself and to be able to look at some of these influences and so forth and decide what was right for me, what wasn't right for me. Still spent a lot of time in the woods. There's a lot of woods around Santa Cruz. And was in two different covens, one as a high priestess and one as a member of one was a mixed coven, the other was an all women's coven. So I was getting plenty of ritual experience and encounters with people and so forth, which was very interesting. And I was in therapy. So that also was another layer of things I had to work on. I first went into self-defense class because the guy I went to Santa Cruz with assaulted me in front of my daughter and my son, and I was terrified and that he was going to show up and assault me again. And I wanted to show my daughter that there are things that you can do and you don't have to stand there and take it. So she actually was enrolled in the self-defense class with me. I thought it was a good thing. She thought so too, and still does. And then I went into the incest survivors group. So I, at that point, realized that we have different aspects. My emotional development had stopped about the age of 6 when I was first sexually assaulted by my uncle. And I did not have appropriate responses to people. I was not emotionally available. I was a child when it came to those kinds of interactions. Did not know how to say I was sorry, did not know how to take responsibility for things. My mental capacity had obviously continued to flourish, and, yeah. And my spiritual side had also continued to develop. So this is when I became aware of the fact that there are different parts of you that can evolve at different rates of speed. And so the incest survivors group helped me with the emotional part. I was able to grow up from being a 6-year-old to an adult. It was kind of interesting, I'm sure, for my housemates going through that. It certainly was interesting for me. But I succeeded, and I'm now, I feel, at least, a pretty integrated individual who's self-aware of my own responsibilities and take responsibility for my actions. And because of that, I choose my actions carefully. This is the whole thing on ethics, etc. So, the Starhawk's workshop was marvelous. There were lots of other rituals I got to go to in Santa Cruz that were also marvelous, Native American rituals. And when I was in Canada, I went to the Native American medicine wheel ceremonies 4 years in a row. So I was definitely making progress on the spiritual side. So I'm glad that my emotional aspects began to catch up so I could actually get somewhere with it and not taking things personally, realizing that people are, people don't know what they're talking about in general. Most of us don't. We know maybe our own thing, but maybe only a small part of our own thing. So how can we make judgments against other people? But you do know what's good for you and what's not good for you at a core level. It's always important to follow your instincts and stay away from situations. And that was part of my influence, was free will and being given the right to decide what was okay for me and what wasn't okay for me. So I really, I met Z Budapest here in Oregon. She came to our local library. I was like, do they know who she is? I was pretty excited about that, so I went to the library meeting, and it was fun to meet her. And, sort of got more into what I was doing. And then I had some fallow years where ritual was just not something I was doing a lot of, and started a group. and then that fell apart, and then started another group, and then that fell apart, then got lessons, and that fell apart. It's been interesting. Apparently groups are just not our thing at the moment. So thinking about influences is like, if I hadn't been already certain about what a witch was, I have no idea what I would have learned from those first set of books. I actually went to the National Archive and the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. when I lived there, and got some ancient manuscripts about witchcraft out and tried to read them. That was something else. I read all the Seth material too. That's when I was still in Regina, before I left my second husband. That was right around the time that happened. So I was like delving into things, took a class on psychic development, was very excited about being able to share with people some of the weirdnesses that I'd experienced, because, I thought this was a safe environment for that kind of thing. Yeah, it did not turn out to be safe. They were mostly academics that were there, and they determined that I must be lying about everything I said, because no one could have that many different kinds of spiritual and magical experiences. I must have read a lot of books, and I was making it all up, which was quite crushing for me, because truthfulness is important to me. I was kind of disillusioned by that. But still, everything that happens to us shapes us, and it's not so much the thing itself as our response to it that decides what kind of an effect it's going to have. And you know a little bit about my history at this point, or you should if you've been watching my videos at all. I come from a horrific background. Emotional, physical, and sexual abuse, torture. Pretty much, not as bad as some, worse than others. I don't try to compare, but certainly not a happy childhood by any means. And certainly a setup for either being crazy, suicidal, or bitter, or become a fanatic of some kind. I mean, there's any number of scenarios that could have happened to me that didn't. And why, I'm not sure. Partly because I remembered when I was born certain things about what I knew were true, and certain things that I knew weren't true. And when I made the commitment, around the time I was reading the Seth material, I think, and a book about mediums, which was an old text, which was very heavy to read, but interesting anyway, because I had mediumship things that were happening to me at that time, and I was trying to learn more about how to control my abilities. I don't know where I was going with that. Apparently my brain just wandered off somewhere. Influences. Okay, gotcha. One of the things I came to the conclusion after reading a lot of these books and meeting people and so forth, is that people really don't know much. We have a lot of biases constantly. We're always coming at something without an open mind. People think they have an open mind, but in reality, most of us don't have an open mind, because you have preconceived notions about how things are supposed to work and what's supposed to happen that can sort of stop you from having a full experience of whatever it happens to be. So, as I realized that, I made a commitment. To throw out human definitions of everything, because I realized that all the information I'd gotten up until that point had been pre-digested and arranged by people who are not the best arbiters of reality, in my opinion, and that what I thought I knew might not be true. That reality is reality, regardless of what we think of it. That was sort of the basis of that. It's like reality exists. No matter what our theories are, our beliefs are, what path we're following, reality exists beyond all of that. we're just sort of a small part. Our part of reality is a small part. And, and each day is a smaller part. I mean, we're not that important when it comes to the greater scheme of the entire universe. And if I truly wanted to understand, or at least have a chance to understand what was going on, I needed to drop all those human definitions of what things were and what things were supposed to be and what things meant. And just allow myself to have the raw, unfiltered experience and leave the definitions alone completely. Just leave them aside. And because of that, I've had some amazing experiences, incredible experiences. It's like opened up an entire new avenue of communication with the universe by not having a preconceived notion of what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm free to just be and then do what I choose to do when it comes up, and choose not to do if I don't want to. Free will, really important. So it's an interesting kind of thought process thinking about that. And I know everyone else has got a different experience. Like people who come from a really super fundamentalist Christian background or other religious background have got a lot of preconceived notions because the entire universe and everything in it has been defined as being part of a great battle between good and evil. In general, that's what religions are. If you're a member of a religion that doesn't do that, good. I'm so happy. But in general, that's what I've seen. And once you start having battles between good and evil, light and dark, us versus them, then the opportunity to experience reality on its own is kind of lost in the noise. So I encourage everybody to think about what their influences are and how that's impacted you, and then look at and evaluate to see whether they're good influences or not, or valid influences or not, whether you agree with them or not. This is part of shadow work, to look at those things in ourselves and to try and identify, what our biases might be and so forth, and just try being without the definitions and without the jumping to conclusions, without having to know what everything means. A crow cawed 3 times out my window. Does that mean I'm going to die or whatever? It's a crow and it cawed 3 times outside your window. Maybe it wanted to say hello. I don't know. Maybe it has nothing to do with you. Maybe it has to do with its crow partner that's trying to get his attention. Maybe something's going on down the street, trying to let everybody know what's happening. They are babblers. They like to share information. So find a way to even take 5 minutes or so at a time and try and just experience something without it having to mean something in particular. Whatever it is, whether it's sitting in your garden, taking a walk in the woods, looking at a cloud, reading a book, watching TV, I don't care. It's just try and do that with a different kind of mindset and see what happens. Because I think that's one of the keys to magic. You can't do good magic if you're missing out on most of reality, I think. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. But anyway, that's some of the stuff I thought about when we were at the cabin. As you can tell, I had a lot of time for my mind to wander. So if you have any questions about this video or any of the other things that we do here, feel free, send us a comment, send us a question. You can send questions to shifrasmagicalcove@gmail.com. You can join me on Facebook, send me a friend's request or whatever, and talk to you later on this week. So, blessed be everybody. This is Siofra's Magic Alcove, and I'm Siofra Bradigan.